Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event at the South Bank Centre in London. Welcome to everyone here in the Queen Elizabeth Hall. I'm James Runcie, Head of Literature here at the South Bank Centre. And welcome also to everybody online, because this special event by every one of the writers shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize is being live streamed tonight at www.themanbookerprize.com. I say every writer. Actually, we've got 5 out of 6. Jim Crace is on his way. So stand by for a bit of upstaging by Jim as he arrives halfway through in true Benedict Cumberbatch style. There'll be a full recording available of the event from tomorrow night, and you can also tweet about the event from this moment on and pose questions online. The hashtags are ManBookerLive and @LitSouthBank. All the authors will be available to sign copies of their books in the foyer afterwards. Before I hand over to Mark Lawson, who's chairing the show tonight, I just wanted to say very few personal words about why we're doing this at the South Bank Centre and why I think it's important. I've heard and I've read that many people today have doubts about the value of prizes and awards. There are so many of them. It's often invidious to decide who wins and who doesn't. And are they perhaps anything more than a marketing opportunity? Well, I think prizes do matter, especially this one, mainly because literature matters in an age of solipsistic cacophony, where everyone is so busy communicating that there's far more talk than listening, and where it's hard to tell the signal from the noise. Good writing that stops time and forces concentration is more important than ever. I also believe that it's not enough to say that a bestseller is successful because the story alone is strong, and that it doesn't matter whether a book is well written or not. I think it does. I realize I'm straying dangerously into the world of criticism and therefore what is now dismissively termed elitism. But I do really believe there is a difference between literature and typing. These are writers who care, worry, and rework every word, every sentence, every paragraph, and every chapter, as do their editors and their proofreaders. Each word must earn its place. There can be no slack. They declare war on cliché. These authors are not only concerned with character and plot, but also with the weight of a sentence, the balance of a chapter, and the rhythm of a novel as a whole. They want their writing to have its own voice, to be distinctive, resonant, and memorable. You can therefore find things in their work that you cannot find anywhere else. They are not derivative. They are unique, and that is why they are worth reading. And that is why we are here. So please welcome them, and please welcome Mark Lawson. Thank you.
Good evening. 4 days ago, Alice Munro won the Nobel Prize for Literature, having previously been shortlisted some years ago for the Booker Prize, as it then was. So that gives something to aim for the people shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, as it now is this year. We were thinking of borrowing from Dame Edna Everage and calling this event Last Night of the Poms, because as you will know, this is the final year that before the Booker changes its designation from its broad definition of British and Commonwealth fiction to include English language writers anywhere in the world, including the United States of America. The shortlist we're exploring tonight has a number of unusual distinctions. It includes one of the longest books ever shortlisted at 828 pages and one of the shortest at 104 pages. It includes a writer whose first book this is, and a writer who has told us, although he has a reputation for jokes and pranking sometimes that it will be his final book, the one that is shortlisted. We'll obviously ask him about that in the course of the evening when he gets here. The shortlist, as you may well know, but just to explain what will happen, is that each of the shortlisted writers will read from this lectern for a few minutes and then come back and sit down, and I'll ask a couple of questions. We'll go on to the next writer and so on. And then when we got through all six, we'll bring the lights up. We'll take questions from the audience. There are microphones to go round, so just signal in the usual way, and we'll go through as many as we can. It's also, as James Runcie said, being streamed, so we have some questions coming in on Twitter and some that were sent in advance. So that's how we will operate. The authors, you will see with the accents we've already referred to, working from the far end, are NoViolet Bulawayo for We Need New Names, Eleanor Catton for the Luminaries, the currently late Jim Crace for Harvest, Jhumpa Lahiri for the Lowland, Ruth Ozeki and Colm Tóibín. We'd have a bigger problem if Jim Crace were called Jim Brace, because he would be going first alphabetically, but we have a bit of leeway because he's third. So the first writer to read, if I could invite to the lectern, will be NoViolet Bulawayo for We Need New Names.
Hi all, and thank you for coming. We Need New Names is about a 10-year-old girl named Darling growing up in a shanty town called Paradise, and she later moves to the US in search of a better life. I am going to read from the part of the section that's set in Paradise, and it sort of explains how Darling and the residents of Paradise get to be in this shanty town. The chapter is called How They Appeared. They did not come to paradise. Coming would mean that they were choosers, that they first looked at the sun, sat down with crossed legs, picked their teeth, and pondered the decision, that they had the time to gaze at their reflections in long mirrors, perhaps pet their hair, tighten their belts, check the watches on their wrists before looking at the red road and finally announcing, "Now we are ready for this." They did not come. No, they just appeared. They appeared 1 by 1, 2 by 2, 3 by 3. They appeared single file, like ants, in swarms, like flies, in angry waves, like a wretched sea. They appeared in the early morning, in the afternoon, in the dead of night. They appeared with the dust from their crushed houses clinging to their hair and skin and clothes, making them appear like things from another life. Swollen ankles and blisters under their feet, they appeared fatigued by the long walk. They appeared carrying sticks with which they marked the ground for where a shack would begin and end, and these they carefully passed around, partitioning the new land with hands shaking like they were killing something. Squatting to mark the ground like that, they appeared broken, shards of glass people. They appeared with tin, with cardboard, with plastic, with nails, and other things with which to build. And they tried to appear calm as they put up their shacks, nailing tin on tin, piece by piece, bravely looking up at the sky and trying to tell themselves and one another that even here, in this strange new place, the sky was still the same familiar blue, a sign things would work out. Some appeared with children in their arms. There were many who appeared with children held by the hands. The children themselves appeared baffled. They did not understand what was happening to them. And the parents held their children close to their chests and caressed their dusty, unkempt heads with hardened palms, appearing to console them, but really they did not quite know what to say. Gradually, the children gave up and ceased asking questions and just appeared empty, almost, like their childhood had fled and left only the bones of its shadow behind. Mother Love appeared with enormous barrels in which to brew a potent liquor that would make people forget. She also appeared with songs in her throat and the most colorful dresses in her bags. Despite the circumstances, she refused to appear like something coming undone. Generally, the men always tried to appear strong. They walked tall, heads upright, arms steady at the sides, and feet firmly planted like trees, solid Jericho walls of men. But when they went out in the bush to relieve themselves and nobody was looking, they fell apart like crumbling towers and wept with the wretched grief of forgotten concubines. And when they returned to the presence of their women and children and everybody else, they stuck hands deep inside torn pockets until they felt their dry thighs, kicked little stones out of the way, and erected themselves like walls again. But then the women, who knew all the ways of weeping and all there was to know about falling apart, would not be deceived. They gently rose from the earth, beat dust off their skirts, and planted themselves like rocks in front of their men and children and sheikhs, and only then did all appear almost tolerable. Thank you.
NoViolet Bulawayo, reading from We Need New Names. NoViolet has interest because it affects everyone here. This is a time when the whole idea of the book is under threat, the book of this kind, and people talking about downloads, writing online, other ways of writing. Were you always thinking of a conventional book? I mean, was that always your ambition to write a traditional book?
Yes, I very much wanted to write a traditional book, but at the same time I was writing it at a time when things were sort of changing, and I'm very much aware of alternative ways that are sort of coming to the stage, and I don't feel like they are threatening the book as such, but just broadening ways in which people process the book. And I don't think we have a choice except to embrace them. And, yeah.
And writers, most writers are given one country that they write about. You, because of circumstance, you had two. You had Zimbabwe, you had America, and both of them come into this book. That I was interested that it's about the relationship, the transition between those countries, partly.
Oh yes, and I think part of why the book is that way is because those are two countries that I've known intimately. I spent the first 18 years of my life in Zim, and then have been in the US for the past 13 years. And of course, as somebody who was interested in the Zimbabwean story, in the lost decade, it was necessary to do both countries, because in as much as I wanted to tell a book that was Zimbabwean, that engaged with the Zimbabwean experience, part of that experience included thousands of my countrymen leaving the country in the past decade in search of better opportunities. And the US, besides being where I've been based, is also a country, I think, that occupies this position as a land of opportunity. People have always went there for years and years. And I just wanted to look at what it means to be an immigrant in America, and also find ways to sort of demystify the American dream, because it's not It's not altogether rosy.
On the other side of that, though, many readers, certainly in Britain, perhaps in America, would assume that it was a book that could only have been written from outside Zimbabwe. I mean, that is the case.
Sorry.
That you could only have written this book outside Zimbabwe.
I don't believe that I could only have. I think I wrote it because, I was outside, so I wrote it. But I feel imagination cannot be contained. I feel like a book can be written from anywhere, really.
Although it can be censored in some countries, would you have had that imaginative freedom in Zimbabwe?
I believe so. I believe so. In the sense that as a writer, speaking from personal experience, I have always written what I want. And even if I were in Zim, I think I would have even been more inspired to tell my story, because I would have been in a space that was urgent to the project. So I feel like it would have been very possible to still write the same narrative.
And finally, it's one of those books we call one of those books we call a voice novel that depends very strongly on the first-person narration, the voice of the narrator. For example, I love the line, "Jesus Christ died on this day, which is why I have to be out here washing with cold water like this." Did you start with the voice? Did you have that from very early on?
No, I did not have the voice from the beginning. The first drafts were in a third-person voice, and Darling happened along the way. She was just one of those characters who just came from nowhere and stubbornly insisted on taking over. And I think part of the writing process is discovering your strengths and weaknesses. So when Darling showed up, I realized that her voice was where I needed to be, and so I sort of just allowed her to be. And We Need New Names, as we read it today, was born that way.
Thank you very much. For the moment to say we'll all talk together later on. From a first novelist to a second novelist, if I could invite to read from the Luminaries, Eleanor Catton.
Thank you. The Luminaries is a phrase, or as a word, is an astrological term, and it refers to the sun and the moon together. In astrology, the sun and the moon are understood to kind of exist as a pair or in partnership, with the sun governing our outermost or most flourishing selves, and our moons governing our kind of most hidden or innermost selves. In my book, which is set during one of the gold rushes in New Zealand in the 1860s, the sun and the moon are literalized in two people, and I'm going to read a scene where these two people meet for the first time. So the year is 1865, and this is set on the deck of a ship, a steamship, which is just rounding the outer heads of the Otago harbour in southern South Island, New Zealand. And it's just past dawn. Anna turned. A fair-haired boy in a felt cap was leaning against the portside rail. He gestured to the cliffs, and Anna saw the birds whose rancorous call had roused her from her slumber. They hung in a cloud about the cliff face, wheeling, turning, and catching the light. She came forward to the rail. They looked to her like very large gulls, their wings black on the tops and white beneath, their heads perfectly white, their beaks stout and pale. As she watched, one made a low pass in front of the boat, its wingtips skimming the surface of the water. Beautiful, she said. Are they petrels or gannets, maybe? They're albatrosses. The boy was beaming. They're real albatrosses. Just wait till this fellow comes back. He will in a moment. He's been circling the ship for some time. Good Lord, what a feeling that must be, to fly. Can you imagine it? Anna smiled. She watched as the albatross glided away from them, turned, and began climbing on the wind. They're terrifically good luck, albatrosses, the boy was saying, and they're the most incredible flyers. One hears stories of them following ships for months and months and through all manner of weather, halfway round the world sometimes. Lord only knows where these ones have been and what they've witnessed, for that matter. When it turned on its side, it became almost invisible, a needle of white, pale against the sky. So few birds are truly mythical, the boy went on, still watching the albatross. I mean, there are ravens, I suppose, and perhaps you might say that doves have a special meaning too, but no more than owls do, or eagles. An albatross is different. It has such a weight to it, such symbolism. It's angelic almost. Even saying the name, one feels a kind of thrill. I'm so glad to have seen one. I feel almost touched. And how wonderful that they guard the mouth of the harbour like they do. How's that for an omen, for a gold town? I heard them calling. That was what roused me, and I came to topside because I couldn't place the sound. I thought it was pigs at first. Anna looked at him sidelong. Was the boy making an overture of friendship? He was speaking as if they were close familiars, though in fact they had not exchanged more than perfunctory greetings on the journey from Sydney, Anna having kept largely to the women's quarters and the boy to the men's. She did not know his name. She had seen him from a distance, of course, but he had not made any particular impression upon her, good or bad. She saw now that he was something of an eccentric. Their calling roused me too, she said, and then, I suppose I ought to go and wake the others. It's too perfect a sight to be missed. Don't, the boy said. Oh, don't. Would you mind? I couldn't bear to have a crowd of people jostling about, not at this hour. Somebody's bound to say, instead of the cross, the albatross, or he stoppeth one of three, and then the rest of the journey would be quite lost to argument. Everybody trying to piece together the poem, I mean, and quarrelling over which pieces go where, with each man trumping the next and showing off his memory. Let's just enjoy it for ourselves. Dawn is such a private hour, don't you think? Such a solitary hour. One always hears that said of midnight, but I think of midnight as remarkably companionable, everybody together, sleeping in the dark. I'm afraid I'm interrupting your solitude, Anna said. No, the boy said. Oh, no. Solitude is a condition best enjoyed in company. He grinned at her quickly, and Anna smiled back. Especially the company of one other soul, he added, turning back to the sea. It's dreadful to feel alone and really be alone, but I love to enjoy the feeling when I'm not. Hark at him, the beauty. He'll circle back in a moment. Birds always make me think of ships, Anna said. He turned to her, eyes wide. Do they? He said. Anna blushed under his direct attention. The boy's eyes were a deep brown. His brows were thick and his lips very full. He was wearing a felt cap with a flat brim. Beneath it, his hair was a dark gold, rather unruly where it curled around his temples and over his ears. Clearly it had been cropped close some months ago, and he had not returned to a barber since. It's just a fancy, she said, becoming shy. But you must follow through, said the boy. You must go on. Heavy ships are so graceful in the water, Anna said at last, looking away. Compared to lighter crafts, I mean. If a boat is too light, if it bobs about on the waves, there's no grace to its motion. I believe that it's the same with birds. Large birds are not buffeted about by the wind. They always look so regal on the air. This fellow, seeing him fly is like seeing a heavy ship cut through a wave. They watched as the albatross circled back to make his pass again. Anna stole a look at the boy's shoes. They were brown leather, tightly laced, neither too shiny nor too worn, giving her no clues about his origin. In all likelihood, he was coming to make his fortune on the Otago goldfields, like every other man on board. You're quite right, the boy cried. Yes, indeed, it's not at all like watching a sparrow, is it? He's weighted, exactly like a ship, exactly so. I should like to see him in a storm, said Anna. What a peculiar wish, said the boy, delighted. But yes, now that you say it, I believe I feel the same way. I should like to see him in a storm as well. They lapsed into silence. Anna waited for the boy to offer his name, but he did not speak again, and presently their solitude was interrupted by the arrival of others on deck. The boy doffed his hat, and Anna dropped a curtsy. In the next moment, he was gone. Anna turned back to the ocean. The colony was behind them now, and the grunts and squeals of the albatrosses had dwindled to nothing, swallowed by the deep thrum of the steamer and the great roaring hush of the sea. Thank you.
Thank you to Eleanor Catton reading from the Luminaries. There's a huge amount of factual information, or I suppose factual information in the book, historical visits of the period it's set. Writers have different attitudes towards research. Some insist on doing all the research before they start writing. Some people research it when they get to it. One of them, oddly enough, if he turns up, Jim Crace, I think makes it all up. He's admitted. So with those three options, which are you closer to?
Well, I mean, before I start writing, I have to have a kind of quite a large critical mass behind me. But for this book, and for my first book as well, it wasn't actually the kind of the textural stuff of the book. It was more kind of a ideological or kind of philosophical kind of research that I had to do. So with this book, the first kind of avenues that opened themselves up to me before I started writing were actually to do with theology and philosophy. And I was reading a lot, particularly I got a collected works of Jung that was really important to me. You know, he was quite a keen astrologer and quite nuts in some of his writings, and I really kind of liked his more batty ideas. So kind of following him down that road. And kind of another avenue was a really amazing and important to me book of theology called I and Thou by Martin Buber, which was also kind of a touchstone, I suppose, or kind of a launching pad.
And the structure of the book, as many people have understandably commented, is extraordinary. 12 sections, with each section being half the length of the one before. At what point in the process did you decide on that design?
I had the idea from the very beginning. I'd actually really wanted to pattern the book on the golden ratio and have each part of the book stand in golden ratio to the one beforehand. And when I did all the maths for that, I came up with a figure of that was just a little bit longer than War and Peace. It's a really, really long book. And I thought, oh, bummer, I can't do that. And so I did it again. I did the maths again and tried to halve it every time to kind of create a kind of spiral. And this time came up with a figure of 270,000. And I thought, oh, bummer, I can't do that either. But the book kept on growing, and I think that, if I'm being completely honest, I probably had kept that in my mind as still a possibility. I didn't really want to jettison it, because 270,000 is what the book is now. That is the length of the book now. So I kind of, as soon as I got to around about halfway, I realized that it could work, and then it was kind of downhill, so to speak, from there.
It also strikes me, which may have been the point, it made it editor-proof, because the editor couldn't say, can we lose 6 pages from chapter 3, because then the design would collapse.
Oh yes, no, I think that the proper term is an editorial nightmare. Yeah.
And the question of length, as you will realize, is going to come up with 2 of the writers tonight. Did you, so having come up with that design, you always knew it was going to be a huge book?
I suppose so. I mean, I mean, I don't know very far ahead when I start writing. One thing that's really important to me is to try and remain as close as possible to the reader's experience in reading the book. And I find that if you know too much in advance, then your experience becomes detached from theirs, because you have prescience, which obviously they don't have. And so I began with quite a simple scene, which is the first scene of the book, where a man newly arrived on the west coast in New Zealand. It's a stormy night, and he unwittingly gate crashes a party of 12 men, each of whom in their personalities happen to typify the 12 signs of the zodiac. And he himself kind of brings an astrological influence, I suppose, to their discussion. And I had no idea where the book was going. I just thought that would be a cool way to begin. And it was like that all the way along.
Well, thank you very much for now. I don't have an earpiece. I was told before we came on that Jim Crace may just appear from the wings. Yes! He has. Thank you, Jim. Yes. We're going to do like Tinkerbell, put our hands together and believe and hope you might turn up, but you have, so it's great. So our third writer, in perfect alphabetical order, having been at a previous event earlier today, Jim Crace with Harvest.
Gosh, never try to drive from Dorset to London in an hour and a half. So you've learned something tonight. My book, Harvest, owes a lot to the area of England that I've lived in the last 40 years, the Midlands. You can't go for a walk in the West Midlands or the East Midlands without encountering those fields, which are beautifully etched with the narrative of enclosures, the ridge and furrow of the last time those fields were ploughed. They leave a beautiful pattern in the fields, but of course they're actually a record of a dispossession. And so something which is beautiful is also evidence of something which is immensely sad. The book is set at a time of enclosure, but really its subject matter is contemporary because the subject matter is also to do with how we are very tolerant and open to incomers and to visitors when things are going well for us. But the real question is, how do societies cope when we ourselves are under pressure and there are incomers arriving at our borders? So the section I'm going to read you tonight deals with a small family that have come to a village, somewhere I suppose it's in the Midlands, set up home. They've hoped that if they can build a small cottage, a small house, a small hut, and it survives for one night, and they can light a fire and it can let out smoke for one night, they will have the right to stay forever and they will be able to enjoy the common land. And of course, the locals are very distressed by this. They're about to have their fields turned into profits and sheep, and so they need scapegoats, and this family becomes the scapegoat, and their hut is knocked down. This was the moment that the woman showed her face. No witnesses are in any hurry to blot out the vision of her rising from the den. She had been hidden and confined below the sacking roof all along, I'm told excitedly by almost everyone who saw her. She is the burning topic for this evening. While her men, no one knows yet what their kinship might be between the three of them, were concealed among the trees, she was evidently sitting up inside her crude dwelling and peering out between the branches and the earthy daub at what I have to call a mob. She will have wondered at the anger they brought with them, their fearsome staves and sticks, the glinting silver of their sickle blades. She will have seen a stocky young man with the stone-green eyes of a cottage cat step forward and bring his clonking stick down on her roof and on her skull. The face that showed itself was running wet with blood, and her black hair was further darkened with a wound. The whole encounter was transformed by blood, I'm told. What was a routine standoff between two sets of men, two sets of armed men, both ready to defend themselves incautiously, had, in a trice, become an occasion of shame. The woman's wound was too red and fresh not to take notice of. Indeed, the blood was marking her cheeks like tears. At once, the village women began to call out for restraint. Their men did not attempt those 2 more steps. They let their weapons fall away into the undergrowth or hang loosely from their hands. Again, it was Mr. Quill who didn't do what he was told. Despite the closeness of the bow, he moved forward, awkwardly, pulled aside the topmost branches of their den, put out his hand, and helped the bloody woman step into the light. What were they to make of her? She was not beautiful, not on first encounter anyhow. She had what we might call, behind her back, a weasel face, wide-cheeked, thin-lipped, a short receding chin, a button nose, and eyes and hair as shiny, dark, and dangerous as belladonna berries. What caught our women's eyes at once was the velvet shawl she wore around her shoulders, an expensive lordly weave in heavy Turkish mauve and silver thread. Their instinct was to call out, "Mind your cloth!" Her blood was bulbing on her little chin and might soon drop to spoil the velvet. Their second thought declared, she's dressed beyond her station. A woman of her kind could not possess a shawl such as that without first stealing it. Even Lucy Kent, the master's wife, had never owned a shawl such as that. Indeed, a shawl such as that, so far as anybody could remember, had never crossed the village boundaries before. It's not surprising, then, that so many of our wives and daughters widened their eyes in envy, hoped to feel the weight of it between their fingers, and wondered what their chances were of wearing it themselves. The village men were not so taken by the cloth. They noticed it, of course, and how it added a becoming colour to the scene. They could imagine making use of it, laid out in the hidden corner of some field far from their wives. But as men will, they were assessing her by standards other than her clothes. They surveyed her, hoof, horn, and tail, and then they surveyed her two men. What they saw was someone who might happily infect their dreams, a wide-hipped woman who was enthralling to behold in ways they never could explain, and all the more so for not being beautiful or statuesque, but rather someone within reach. Thank you.
Welcome. You want to sit there? Jim Crace reading from Harvest, his 11th book, and we might as well settle this, as you know, a journalist alive, which you were one. It's being repeated again in all the papers today with his final book, Harvest. So is it?
Perhaps. Whatever the last rumour was, I'd want to start a new one. When I said that I would not write another novel, it was at a time when the novel I was writing was failing. And I felt that my mojo as a writer had disappeared. And I felt that the generosity of narrative, which I'd always relied upon in the past, wasn't as certain as I'd always believed it was. But since that time, I've written Harvest. And that was such a pleasure that the thought of not writing another novel is less exciting than it was. But you know, writing novels isn't the only thing to do. There are plenty of other things to do in life, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life sitting in front of a blank screen with no colleagues, so I want to do something more collegiate.
Such as?
Well, I'm writing a stage play at the moment. The great thing about stage plays is that if it's not good, the director takes a third of the blame, and the actors take the rest, whereas if you write novels, you get the whole blame yourself. So.
You probably won't. Can you tell us anything about the play?
It's a retelling of the Minotaur legend, and it's full of theatrical flourishes. I like sort of Shakespearean drama in which it's dead on. Well, the Shakespeare's not dead on the page, but you need the art director and you need music to make it all work. And it's about scapegoating, and of course the Minotaur legend is perfect because it's the point in which civilization meets the savage. And that has always interested me in my books, and it interests me in the stage as well. And it's about, yet again, it's about scapegoating.
And just before you got here, I was talking to Eleanor about research, and I mentioned you as someone who in the past has admitted freely just making up pathological information, epigraphs from imagined books, and so on. So what about history? Do you just make that up?
Yeah, just make it up, yeah. If you want to read history, there are history books to read. But that's not the function for me as a novelist. I like to invent things. You're spending every day by yourself, and mostly your friends are bored with what you do, and your family are sick of hearing about it. And so, if you're not entertaining yourself, then you're not entertaining anybody. And what was fun for me was to invent a landscape. And there is an opening scene in Harvest where they walk the bounds of this village. And that village doesn't exist. But for me, the reader reads it, I was also walking the bounds as I wrote it. I was inventing this landscape as I wrote it. And that was deeply satisfying. It was a walk into the unknown for me in the same way as it's a read into the unknown for the readers. And that's just the fun that I have. Telling lies is a lot of fun.
Does it annoy people? And with Being Dead, for example, did you get stern letters from pathologists saying, this isn't right?
Yeah, in fact, actually, it might have been your program. I think you had a Home Office pathologist.
Yes, we did.
Review the book, which and I don't know that you come out this very well, actually, Mark. He was saying, surely not. If 2 dead bodies were found on a beach, the procedures would be this and the other. Well, that's the death of fiction. This realist tradition of fiction is relatively new. The traditional form of fiction, nobody would be saying, there's no such thing as a minotaur. Beowulf couldn't possibly exist. People understand in folk history and in traditional stories that this is a lie. This is not there. The writer is not holding a mirror up to the real world to make you feel positioned. They're trying to make you feel awkward and put you in unfamiliar territory.
No, that was Radio 4's Revenge on You. Earlier, you'd won one of our competitions under your dog's name, as I remember.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you got form.
Yeah, my dog is now dead. Thank you for bringing that up.
I'm sorry. Well, he won the competition anyway, but it's...
She,
I'm sorry. Well, there we go. Rhythm has always interested me in your writing. That your publishers, Picador, describe your prose as hypnotic. But I more kindly with the rhythm of it, so that sometimes it does seem to approach poetry, but we're only two and we do not mean to make a meal of it, we mean to make only a day of it, and Aristar is all we have in mind. Whereas a poet, I mean, clearly it's a more formal restriction, would work out the beats. I mean, is that something you pay a lot of attention to?
Well, one well-known critic said that to read a paragraph of my book was to invite a migraine. But actually, the traditions of oral storytelling ignore music and percussion and all of those things at their peril. And in fact, most people, it's only in the written forms of the English language that there's a lack of rhythm and there's a lack of music. When we talk to each other in pubs and at parties and in families, there's a natural cadence to the English language that I don't think that I want to ignore when I'm writing. I'm not trying to write poetic, there are no rhymes, of course, in it, but I am very aware that there's an extra beauty to the language which is not only to do with vocabulary, it's also to do with where the vocabulary falls, where the word falls. And that's something that an oral storyteller would know, would understand that it would be in their blood. So the thing is about that, if you don't like it, you can stop reading my books.
No, I do like it. That
no, I
critic
don't mean
didn't.
you.
Yeah.
It's something that I'm addicted to, yeah.
And do you speak it out? Do you oralize it when you're writing it?
Yes, I do, but I think that most writers would do that anyway. You read out to yourselves, in a slightly mad way. Yes.
Thank you very much, Jim Crace. For the moment, we'll talk more later, I say. The fourth of our 6 shortlisted Man Booker authors, 2013, Jhumpa Lahiri with The Lowland. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm honored to be here. I'm going to read a brief section from the beginning of The Lowland. It's set in Calcutta. This section of the book is set in Calcutta in the late 1950s. They'd never set foot in the Tolly Club. Like most people in the vicinity, they'd passed by its wooden gate, its brick walls, hundreds of times. Until the mid-40s, from behind the wall, their father used to watch horses racing around the track. He'd watched from the street, standing among the bettors and other spectators, unable to afford a ticket or to enter the club's grounds. But after the Second World War, around the time Subhash and Udayan were born, the height of the wall was raised so that the public could no longer see in. Bismillah, a neighbor, worked as a caddy at the club. He was a Muslim who had stayed on in Taliganj after partition. For a few paisha, he sold them golf balls that had been lost or abandoned on the course. Some were sliced like a gash in one's skin, revealing a pink, rubbery interior. At first, they hit the dimpled balls back and forth with sticks. Then, Bismillah also sold them a putting iron with a shaft that was slightly bent. A frustrated player had damaged it, striking it against a tree. Bismillah showed them how to lean forward, where to place their hands. Loosely determining the objective of the game, they dug holes in the dirt and tried to coax the balls in. Though a different iron was needed to drive the ball greater distances, they used the putter anyway. But golf wasn't like football or cricket, not a sport the brothers could satisfactorily improvise. In the dirt of the playing field, Bismillah scratched out a map of the Tali Club. He told them that closer to the clubhouse there was a swimming pool, stables, a tennis court, restaurants where tea was poured from silver pots, special rooms for billiards and bridge, gramophones playing music, bartenders in white coats who prepared drinks called Pink Lady and Gin Fizz. The club's management had recently put up more boundary walls to keep intruders away. But Bismillah said that there were still sections of wire fencing where one might enter along the western edge. They waited until close to dusk when the golfers headed off the course to avoid the mosquitoes and retreated to the clubhouse to drink their cocktails. They kept the plan to themselves, not mentioning it to other boys in the neighborhood. They walked to the mosque at their corner, its red and white minarets distinct from the surrounding buildings. They turned onto the main road, carrying the putting iron and 2 empty kerosene tins. They crossed to the other side of Technician Studio. They headed toward the paddy field where the Adi Ganga once flowed, where the British had once sailed boats to the delta. These days it was stagnant, lined with the settlements of Hindus who'd fled from Dhaka, from Rajshahi, from Chittagong. A displaced population that Calcutta accommodated but ignored. Since partition a decade ago, they had overwhelmed parts of Taliganj the way monsoon rain obscured the lowland. Some of the government workers had received homes in the exchange program, but most were refugees arriving in waves stripped of their ancestral land. A rapid trickle, then a flood. Subhash and Udayan remembered them, a grim procession, a human herd, a few bundles on their heads, infants strapped to parents' chests. They made shelters of canvas or thatch, walls of woven bamboo. They lived without sanitation, without electricity, in shanties next to garbage heaps, in any available space. They were the reason the Adi Ganga, on the banks of which the Tali Club stood, was now a sewer canal for southwest Calcutta. They were the reason for the club's additional walls. Subhash and Udayan found no wire fencing. They stopped at a spot where the wall was low enough to scale. They were wearing shorts. Their pockets were stuffed with golf balls. Bismillah said they would find plenty more inside the club, where the balls lay on the ground alongside the pods that fell from tamarind trees. Udayan flung the putting iron over the wall, then one of the kerosene tins. Standing on the remaining tin would give Subhash enough leverage to make it over, but Udayan was a few inches shorter in those days. "Lace your fingers," Udayan said. Subhash brought his hands together. He felt the weight of his brother's foot, the worn sole of his sandal, then his whole body bearing down for an instant. Quickly, Udayan hoisted himself up. He straddled the wall. "Should I stand guard on this side while you explore?" Subhash asked him. "What fun would that be? What do you see? Come, see for yourself." Subhash nudged the kerosene tin closer to the wall. He stepped onto it, feeling the hollow structure wobble beneath him. "Let's go, Subhash." Udayan readjusted himself, dropping down so that only his fingertips were visible. Then he released his hands and fell. Subhash could hear him, breathing hard from the effort. "You're all right?" "Of course, now you." Subhash gripped the wall with his hands, hugging it to his chest, scraping his knees. As usual, he was uncertain whether he was more frustrated by Udayan's daring or with himself for his lack of it. Subhash was 13, older by 15 months, but he had no sense of himself without Udayan. From his earliest memories, at every point, his brother was there. Suddenly, they were no longer in Taliganj. They could hear the traffic continuing down the street, but could no longer see it. They were surrounded by massive cannonball trees and eucalyptus, bottlebrush, and frangipani. Subhash had never seen such grass as uniform as a carpet, unfurled over sloping contours of earth, undulating like dunes in a desert or gentle dips and swells in a sea. It was shorn so finely on the putting green that it felt like moss when he pressed against it. The ground below was as smooth as a scalp, the grass appearing a shade lighter there. He had not seen so many egrets in one place, flying off when he came too close. The trees threw afternoon shadows on the lawn, their smooth limbs divided when he looked up at them like the forbidden zones of a woman's body. They were both giddy from the thrill of trespassing, from the fear of being caught, but no guard on foot or horseback, no groundsman spotted them. No one came to chase them away. Thank you.
Thank you to Jhumpa Lahiri reading from the Lowland. I mentioned Alice Munro earlier, and it was interesting when she won the Nobel Prize, they talked about the importance of the short story, and she herself has talked about having to resist the pressure to think the novel was a greater form. I just wonder, you've had considerable success with short stories. Did you feel that you were heading towards a novel or the pressure to do so?
Well, I started out by writing short stories. I started out by writing very little in general, so everything was short. But then when I began to think about writing more seriously, I was in a phase of simply sort of stockpiling different ideas, things that interested me. And in that period, 16, 17 years ago, the idea for the Lowland was one of those things. And even though I hadn't written a novel yet, I knew, I think, from reading novels, I suppose, that it would be a novel, that it would have to be a novel. And similarly with the other novel I've written, I felt that idea also needed the space, the breadth of a novel, whereas with other ideas, I feel that they work better as a short story or as a longer story. I think of everything as a story, really, and whether it becomes something divided into chapters or not is a sort of secondary concern.
And there's an interesting overlap with NoViolet's book, which a book that begins in one culture, in her case Africa, yours India, and then goes to others, including America. And again, it's the same case for you, that you are, and I think it is luck, it's useful, you have access to more than one culture to write about.
Well, I was raised with two cultures and raised with both a surplus and a lack of cultures. I mean, sort of between two worlds and never knowing which one to call my own. And so that has been the reality of my life and has informed my work from the beginning.
But there's been a lot of talk, as you know, about literary nationality because of the Booker qualifications changing. Do you define yourself nationally or internationally as a writer?
I define myself as a writer, and I feel very grateful to finally be able to do that. I think that apart from my family and the other people I love in the world, I have no allegiance to any place. But I think that when I became a writer, when I began to feel comfortable to call myself that, it opened up a whole other dimension of belonging to other writers, both those I share the stage with this evening and also those who have written before me, and who have taught me. And that is an extraordinary feeling of belonging that is, in the end, far more meaningful to me than a sort of national identity.
Thank you very much for the moment to Jhumpa Lahiri. Our penultimate shortlisted writer by alphabet is Ruth Ozeki, A Tale for the Time Being.
So thank you for coming, and it is truly an honor to be here with these wonderful writers. I think I'm going to start reading a little bit from the beginning, so I don't have to do too much explanation here. Hi. My name is Now, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? Well, if you give me a moment, I will tell you. A time being is someone who lives in time, and that means you and me and every one of us who is or was or ever will be. As for me, right now, I'm sitting in a French-made cafe in Akiba Electricity Town, listening to a sad chanson that's playing sometime in your past, which is also my present, writing this and wondering about you, somewhere in my future. And if you're reading this, then maybe by now you're wondering about me too. You wonder about me. I wonder about you. Who are you, and what are you doing? Are you in a New York subway car hanging from a strap, or soaking in your hot tub in Sunnyvale? Are you sunbathing on a sandy beach in Phuket, or having your toenails buffed in Brighton? Are you a male or a female, or somewhere in between? Is your girlfriend cooking you a yummy dinner, or are you eating cold Chinese noodles from a box? Are you curled up with your back turned coldly towards your snoring wife, or are you eagerly waiting for your beautiful lover to finish his bath so you can make passionate love to him? Do you have a cat, and is she sitting on your lap? Does her forehead smell like cedar trees and fresh, sweet air? Actually, it doesn't matter very much, because by the time you read this, everything will be different, and you will be nowhere in particular flipping idly through the pages of this book, which happens to be the diary of my last days on Earth, wondering if you should keep on reading. And if you decide not to read anymore, hey, no problem, because you're not the one I was waiting for anyway. But if you do decide to read on, then guess what? You're my kind of time being, and together we'll make magic. So this is the voice of a young girl, Naoko Yasutani, that kind of came to me in 2006. And when a voice comes, you know certain things about it, about the character. I knew that she was a young teenage girl. I knew that she had an attitude and she had a sense of humor. And so at that point, my job is to just follow that voice. The other thing is that Now knew that she was writing to somebody, but she didn't know who she was writing to. And so, of course, I didn't either at first. As it turns out, I discovered several years later that she was writing to a woman, a novelist, who lives on a remote island in the Pacific Northwest. Coincidentally, I also am a novelist living on a remote island in the Pacific Northwest. And the novelist's name is Ruth. A tiny sparkle caught Ruth's eye, a glint of refracted sunlight angling out from beneath a massive tangle of drying bull kelp which the sea had heaved up onto the sand at full tide. She mistook it for the sheen of a dying jellyfish and almost walked right by it. The beaches were overrun with jellyfish these days, the monstrous, red, stinging kind that looked like wounds along the shoreline. But something made her stop. She leaned over and nudged the heap of kelp with the toe of her sneaker and then poked it with a stick. Untangling the whip-like fronds, she dislodged enough to see that what glistened underneath was not a dying sea jelly, but something plastic, a bag. Not surprising, the ocean was full of plastic. She dug a bit more until she could lift the bag up by its corner. It was heavier than she expected, a scarred plastic freezer bag encrusted with barnacles that spread across its surface like a rash. It must have been in the ocean for a long time, she thought. Inside the bag, she could see a hint of something red. Someone's garbage, no doubt, tossed overboard or left behind after a picnic or a rave. The sea was always heaving things up and hurling them back. Fishing lines, floats, beer cans, plastic toys, tampons, Nike sneakers. A few years earlier, it was severed feet. People were finding them up and down Vancouver Island, washed up on the sand. One had been found on this very beach. No one could explain what had happened to the rest of the bodies. Ruth didn't want to think about what might be rotting inside the bag. She flung it farther up the beach. She would finish her walk and then pick it up on the way back, take it home, and throw it out. Well, needless to say, she didn't throw it out. Instead, she brought it home and unpacked it, and inside discovered a Hello Kitty lunchbox, and inside of that, she discovered the hidden diary. Print is predictable and impersonal, conveying information in a mechanical transaction with the reader's eye. Handwriting, by contrast, resists the eye, reveals its meaning slowly, and is as intimate as skin. Ruth stared at the page. The purple words were mostly in English, with some Japanese characters scattered here and there, but her eye wasn't really taking in their meaning as much as a felt sense, murky and emotional, of the writer's presence. The fingers that had gripped the purple gel ink pen must have belonged to a girl, a teenager. Her handwriting, these loopy purple marks impressed on the page, retained her moods and anxieties. And the moment Ruth laid eyes on the page, she knew without a doubt that the girl's fingertips were pink and moist, and that she had bitten her nails down to the quick. Ruth looked at the letters. They were round and a little bit sloppy, as now she imagined the girl must be too. But they stood more or less upright and marched gamely across the page at a good clip. Not in a hurry, but not dawdling either. Sometimes, at the end of a line, they crowded each other a little, like people jostling to get onto an elevator or into a subway car, just as the doors were closing. Ruth's curiosity was piqued. It was clearly a diary of some kind. She examined the cover again. Should she read it? Deliberately now, she turned to the first page, feeling vaguely prurient, like an eavesdropper or a peeping Tom. Novelists spend a lot of time poking their noses into other people's business. Ruth was not unfamiliar with this feeling. "Hi," she read. "My name is Now, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is?" Thank you.
Ruth Ozeki reading from A Tale for the Time Being. Ruth, I think people are inevitably always intrigued when a novelist includes a character with their own name and profession. And Philip Roth, for example, has played many games with that. Yeah. Because there's a sort of tease going on in which the reader either assumes it is you or begins to wonder. Yes. So just talk us through that. The stuff that Ruth does, Ruth's diary, when Ruth goes on a trip or has been somewhere, how much is that accurate?
Well, let me just say first that it took me about 6 years to reconcile myself to the fact that I was going to have to actually be in this novel myself. At first, when I thought of it, this was in 2006, when the voice of this girl kind of came into my mind, I thought, well, I'm the novelist, I'm hearing this voice, perhaps I am the intended reader. But I promptly I discarded this idea because it just seemed too, metafictional and awkward and postmodern for all of the wrong reasons. And so I put that aside. And I proceeded to then audition characters for that role, proper fictional characters. And in 2010, I think, I finished a draft of the novel and was about to turn it into my editor when, in the beginning of 2011, March 11th, 2011, the earthquake and tsunami hit the northern coastline of Japan. And, I had friends and family there, and so, it was I spent months, weeks and months, I'm sure we all did, watching the footage of that wave demolish huge swaths of that coastline and kill many people, tens of thousands of people. And, it struck me somewhere in the months that followed that the book that I had written was no longer relevant. It was a pre-earthquake book. And a pre-tsunami book, and a pre-Fukushima book, and I had written, and now we were living in a brand new reality, and so it raised this question, how as a fiction writer do you write about a reality that is so present, and that is so real, and so it was at that point that and actually it was in conversation with my husband, Oliver. He suggested that. That I break the fictional container and step into the narrative myself. And I thought that was a good idea. And I said, that's great, Ollie, but, you do understand that if I'm in the book, then you have to be in the book.
As indeed he is.
Too. As indeed he is, yeah. He's a very brave man. He said that he thought it would be an interesting thought experiment.
Was he allowed a veto over the manuscript?
Oh, he was always allowed a veto, yeah. And in fact, he finished it, and he said that he liked it very much, and that the only problem was that I'd made him too smart. Which actually isn't true. It's not true at all.
I'm fascinated by that so real events to you had made the book irrelevant. In the same way that, as you know, some American writers after 9/11, they felt the same thing, that you were writing about a world that no longer existed, or at least you couldn't have a fictional world in which the real thing hadn't happened. But it was that same feeling.
Well, it was just so immediate, and I knew also that for example, Fukushima was a situation, it was a situation that would be ongoing. It would be unfolding. It would be emerging, that it wasn't going to go away anytime soon, that we're going to be feeling the after effects of Fukushima for a very, very long time. And so, I felt very compelled, especially living on this remote island in Desolation Sound on the opposite side of the same Pacific Ocean, that, I wanted to somehow address that. And so for the first time, I really felt that the way to do this was to sort of step in and put myself on the line, as it were.
And finally, which is in fact from the last page of the book, in the acknowledgements, you say, I offer thanks to the island and the islanders for imbuing my fictional fantastical isle with your very real beauty, tenacity, humor, expertise, and willingness to help. So we found out what Oliver thought, but what has the reaction of the islanders been?
I think, and I hope, maybe they're Canadians, so they might be just being polite, but but so far, everyone has been quite supportive, and I really appreciate the support that I've been getting. One of the things was that I, felt that it would be interesting to write a character who's a cranky New Yorker moving to, this island, and in fact finding everyone there helpful and finding everything she needs.
Thank you very much to Ruth Ozeki. Our final shortlist writer, Colm Tóibín, The Testament of Mary, is written in the voice of what in Catholic iconography is called the Blessed Virgin Mary. I hoped he might bring the outfit, but he's going to do it in a suit.
I'm just going to read three short sections. The first, the three of them are about Lazarus and his sisters. As Lazarus begins to die, they watched helplessly as their brother grew easily towards death, in the same way as a source for a river hidden under the earth begins flowing and carries water across a plain to the sea. They would have done anything to divert the stream, make it meander on the plain and dry up under the weight of the sun. They would have done anything to keep their brother alive. They sent word to my son and they asked him, to come, but he did not. It was something I learned when I saw him myself, that if the time was not right, he would not be disturbed by a merely human voice or the pleadings of anyone he knew. Thus he paid no attention to what he heard from Martha and Mary, and they stayed with their brother so they would be with him when he took his last breath, when he was fully part of the waves of the sea, an invisible aspect of their rhythm. And during those days then, as river water slowly took on the taste of salt, and they buried him, and he lay fresh in the earth, many people who had loved Lazarus and who had known his sisters came to the house to comfort them. There was talk and lamentation. And then 4 days later, he is raised from the dead. Slowly, the figure dirtied with clay and covered in grave clothes wound round him began with great uncertainty to move in the place they had made for him. It was as though the earth beneath him was pushing him and then letting him be still in his great forgetfulness and nudging him again like some strange new creature jerking and wriggling towards life. He was bound with the sheets and his face was covered with a napkin, and now he turned as a child in the freshness of the womb who turns knowing that his time there is up and he must wrestle his way into the world. Loose him and let him go, my son said. And 2 men came, 2 neighbors, and they stood in the grave as those around watched in hushed amazement and fright as they lifted Lazarus and then unbound him. He stood up with merely a cloth around his waist. He had been unchanged by death. Once his eyes opened, he stared at the sun with a deep, unearthly puzzlement, and then at the sky around the sun. He seemed not to see the crowd. Some sounds came from him, not words exactly, something closer to whispered cries or whimpers, and then the crowd stood back as Lazarus moved through them, past them, looking at no one, being led by his sisters back to their house, the world around remaining stilled in silence. My son too, I am told, stilled and silent as Lazarus began to weep. At first they noticed just the tears, but then his crying came in howls as his 2 sisters led him gently towards the house, across the path, followed all the way by the silent crowd as the howling grew louder and more fierce. By the time they reached their door, he could barely walk. They disappeared inside and closed the shutters from the burning sun and did not appear again that day, despite the waiting crowd who lingered hour after hour, even as night fell, and some indeed through the night itself and even as morning came. And then, a few days later, he visits the house where Mary is staying. Their brother stood in the doorway and then moved quietly into the room. When he sighed, all of us moved towards him, and it was then, just then, that the opportunity came, and it was the only one I had, and I think it may have been the only opportunity anyone had to ask him. It was the semi-darkness of the room, the stillness of the air, and the fact that all of us 4 women, would know to keep silent about what we should not speak of. There were a few seconds in which any one of us could have asked him about the cave full of souls where he had been. Was it a place of massive, obliterating darkness? Was there light, of wakefulness, or of dreams, or of deep sleep? Were there voices? Was there pure stillness, or some other sound like the dripping of water, or sighs, or echoes? Did he know anyone? Did he meet his mother, whom we had all loved? Did he remember us as he wandered in the place where he had been? Was there blood or pain? Was it a landscape of dull washed colours, or a red vastness with cliffs or forests or deserts or encroaching mist? Was anyone afraid? Did he wish to return there? Lazarus stood in the darkened room and sighed again, and something was broken. The great chance had escaped us, maybe never to return.
Colm Tóibín, The Testament of Mary. I'll ask Colm a couple of questions, but if we could get the microphones out there ready, and then we'll go straight to the audience questions very, very shortly. Colm, a number of two or three writers tonight have talked about a voice coming to them as the beginning. I mean, this, again, is a voice novel. Was that the case for you?
Yes, I suppose that it occurred to me. I had been teaching some of the Greek tragedies and looking at the way in which the voice of Electra or Medea or Antigone, that heightened, strung-out voice. And it just occurred to me what it would be like, or what it had been like for, it had happened in poetry with figures like Sylvia Plath or Louise Glück in America, who had found a modern way of using this voice. And it struck me that if you could graft that on to this story, then also the idea that St. John, who really is the one who was the novelist, I think, among the four who wrote the Gospels, that he had written the Lazarus story, and he's the one who placed Mary at the foot of the cross, that he had been in Greece before he wrote, and that he possibly had seen Greek theatre, and that he understood something of the power of that figure could have, even over centuries.
And I was thinking, while reading your book, having read Edna O'Brien's memoirs of what happened to her in a much earlier stage in Irish literary history, that it struck me, if you'd written this book, 40, 50 years ago, you would have been banned and transported from from Ireland. But in fact, online, there's some American Christian fundamentalist reaction to it. Did you ever think about taboo or people's reaction?
No, in Ireland, Ireland has changed a great deal, and almost courtesy of figures like Edna O'Brien and John McGahern, who have created a great deal of space for writers, so that the feeling is that, I think everyone feels it, that you're entitled to write whatever you like, and that people respect that. I mean, yes, there have been problems in America, but absolutely no problems in Ireland at all.
And when you get that kind of reaction from some American readers, what is your reaction to the reaction?
Oh, there was, I'm very easy to find because I've got a website and you can just click on contact and send me a quite abusive email. And the thing was that some of the epithets they used, some of the terms they used to describe me were true. You know, they called me various names. Yeah, I am those things. And so I didn't really know what to do. I sort of printed them out and gathered them because I thought maybe the future will need to know that there were still some Americans like that at this time, you know, because I think that will die out too, you know.
And finally, before we open it up, the question, Ian McEwan referred, because he was also, he said that some people think there's something unmanly about a novella trying to win the Man Booker Prize, and this question of does length matter, does it?
Well, I've never been worried about being unmanly, but I don't buy the word novella. I don't really know what it is, but I think a novella might be some small episode from this story told at some length. But this is the whole story. This is the arc of the story. It can't be longer because there's a tone used that won't hold beyond this number of pages. There's sort of a relentlessness in the tone. And so you can't use subplots, flashbacks, journeys. It must move in that staccato way, and a greater length won't hold it.
Okay, we'll take as many questions as we can from the audience. Who would like to start us off? The lights are up, which is a good start. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks. I've got some I've been handed. Can anyone got better eyesight than me? Is there anyone who... Yes, we've got a hand up over there. Can we get the microphone across? Can you keep your hand up so people can see? Yes, that's coming across. And then if there's another microphone, just call for it and we'll do as many as we can. Yes?
It's a question for Colm Tóibín, and I really wonder whether you're very religious or not.
I'm what's called a lapsed Irish Catholic, and I think I'm among many. You know, in other words, that I was brought up in Catholicism, where the figure of Mary would have been immensely important, where the rosary was said in the house every evening, not only the rosary, but the Hail Holy Queen and the Memorare, and so those prayers belonged to me. And some of the words from them may be my first connection to beauty, you know, to words as sonorous, as having cadence. that went beyond what Jim was talking about, that idea of the mere vocabulary. And then I lapsed, and I don't, so I'm not very religious, but I can still be stirred back into that childhood experience, which went on for a very long, until I was 15 or 16, and sometimes it was very deep. So I can be stirred back into it, but I can't at the moment be stirred back into pure belief, or really any belief much.
And Colm, on Twitter from Sam Price, we have a question which I think relates to the fact that Fiona Shaw has played a version of this on Broadway. Will we see a West End, presumably London West End, production of The Testament of Mary?
I hope so, yeah.
And also another one for you, which came in on Twitter, was about the significance of the artistic images of the Blessed Virgin Mary, if they had any for you.
Yeah, there was one particular thing where in Venice, the apotheosis really of the myth of the Virgin, or the cult, or the belief, is Titian's painting of the Virgin Mary being assumed body and soul into heaven, which is really the most beautiful idea, with angels everywhere and the sky above and God above the sky, all waiting for her, this great woman, to be Queen of Heaven. And just up the road, Tintoretto, who took a very dim view, I think, of those sort of images, he made a crucifixion, which is very long. It's a long painting. It's in a secular space called San Rocco, and it has a cross at the middle, but it's filled with untidiness. It's filled with, this story is not a story of fulfillment, but of a story of chaos, of what it might have looked like on the day to someone who didn't know what it was going to mean in the future. And so I worked in a way between those two paintings, between the idea of apotheosis and of sort of glory and of the actual dirty business of crucifying somebody.
Is there somebody out there who's got a microphone ready to go?
Hello?
Yes.
I wanted to ask a question of Eleanor Catton. Your novel is incredibly beautiful and intelligent, and in the passage you read, the male character is somebody who appears very late in the novel, and he struck me as somebody who's like incredibly strange and interesting, and so as a reader, I really wanted to read more about him, and I understand that he was introduced very late because of reasons of plot and suspense. But I was wondering if you, as an author, had wanted to write more about him, or felt that you couldn't because of the constraints of the structure you had imposed, which you spoke about earlier, of ever shortening sections, or if you felt he had sort of a sufficient amount of space.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it was the other way around, that because he's off stage for such a, really, I think probably about 9/10 of the novel, I knew that when he finally came on stage, his personality had to be so kind of in your face that it would make up for all of the absence. And so it was almost that the absence created him rather than the other way around, that his personality made me wish that the absence wasn't there.
Thank you. Who's got... I don't know who's got the best eyesight on this panel, but yes, there's someone over here, yes.
Hi, I am a Zimbabwean from Bulawayo, so I'm here fiercely supporting my countrywoman, but also really, really proud that for the first time, and I'm going to get a bit emotional about this, but for the first time in a very long time, there's some good news coming out of Zimbabwe, which is really, really great. And I just wondered, I know you've recently been in Bulawayo doing a tour, as much of a tour as you can do in Bulawayo, but just curious about what Zimbabwe's reaction has been to your book.
Thank you to my Zimbabwean sister. It's always great to connect with family outside. The reaction to my book has just been amazing. I launched in both Harare and Bulawayo. And of course, I've been writing for a while now, and with social networks like Facebook, I had already been connected with Zimbabwean readers who care about literature. But just being on the ground, in Bulawayo, for example, I had the biggest audience I've ever had anywhere. 300 people came to my book launch, which was like a homecoming to me. So the reaction has been great, and I'm hoping that people still continue to support the arts, support people doing good things. And thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm really worried about people at the back. You might have to wave both arms. Is there anyone in the back section who's...
There's one over there.
Yeah, we got one over... And then I think there is someone in the back, but we got one over there, yeah.
Hello, this is a question for Jim Crace. I was interested in your comments just now about when you start a book, you don't know the direction it's going in, or at least you discover the story along with the reader. And I very much enjoyed reading Harvest. I noticed halfway through the book, for me anyway, seemed to sort of change direction. Were you conscious of that as well?
I've only just found out. No. I'm not... I don't have an analytical understanding of my books, and when I finish writing them, I don't read them again. So in an odd way, I'm very out of touch with my novel. If you're a writer, you don't get a reader's experience, because there's no point that you can enter into the book without knowing exactly what's going to happen in the next sentence, in the next chapter, and so on. But what I like, when I start a novel, what I like to have is a subject matter or a question that I want to answer. Then I like to open myself up to the generosity of narrative. Narrative has been around for thousands of years. It knows a few tricks. It can be mischievous, it can be funny, it can be wise, and it can be generous. And I think that when you're working in this lonely profession, it's terrific to be able to go to work in the morning and be the recipient of generosity and to see what is suggested by the story itself. So very often you'll be surprised what happens. I remember I was talking earlier today to somebody about there is a brutal attack on a visitor to the village, and I didn't know that brutal attack was going to happen until the moment it showed up on the page itself. And so the reader is encountering it when I encounter it. But at the end of that day, I was deeply happy, despite the fact that someone had been beaten up, because I'd been taken by surprise, and I'd been on the receiving end of narrative's generosity. So that's the fun for me. But of course, sometimes if you then follow on, you realize that, that you've written yourself into a corner, and it's then that you have to go back and write yourself out of it. But the thing you mentioned I hadn't noticed, and I'll be rewriting from this evening.
So have you never reread any of the earlier books?
I had to reread Quarantine, because I discussed it on a Radio 4 show recently. God, I was bored.
Well, book club.
Yeah.
Why were you so bored?
Well, reading your own stuff, there are no surprises. It's over-familiar. It's like going to a family party.
Is there... yes, we have got someone at the back, yes.
Wow, that's loud. My question is for Eleanor, and it's similar to the one asked for Jim. But, unlike what Jim said, Eleanor, you mentioned that you don't want to know too much about the plot, and going into the novel, you essentially started with one scene, and that you want to remain sort of attached to the reader, as you put it. You don't want to be detached. So my question was that how aware of the reader are you? Is it like someone looking behind your shoulder? And does it in some ways corrupt your fidelity towards your craft to be so aware of the reader?
I've never put it like that to myself, I think. I've always been quite taken with this idea that one writes for an imagined audience of everybody whom one has ever read, so that you have to imagine that not only have your readers read all of the books that you've ever read yourself, but also that they've written all of the books that you've ever read yourself. And I think that it's, for me at least, it's really important to never, ever underestimate the reader's intelligence or their powers of guessing ahead, I suppose. the reason why this was a big issue for me in this book is because the book is very heavily plotted. And I would imagine it would be quite different in a more stream of consciousness or kind of atmospheric novel, that looking ahead would maybe not be such a big, such a big deal as it was for me in this book. I really didn't want the reader to figure out the solution, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's not really a conventional murder mystery in some respects, but I wanted to be able to have plotted surprises kind of in my pocket. And in order to do that, I had to remember at all times what the reader knew already, what they wanted to know, so far as I could determine that, and what they didn't know what they didn't know they wanted yet, but I was going to hopefully make them want it.
Anyone else who's got a microphone ready?
Hello? Yes. Me. Over here. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is a question addressed to Jhumpa Lahiri. You said, Jhumpa, that you do not have a sense of allegiance to any national identity, but rather to, I think, broadly speaking, literature, over and above friends and family and so on. Now, could that be because, or could that be termed a sort of inheritance of loss, if I may borrow another writer's title, because of your own background? And you said that you grew up in two cultures, not knowing which you could claim as your own.
I think you sort of answered the question in a way by posing it, because I agree. I meant to say alongside friends and family, not above or beyond. But it's exactly as you say. My inability to ever feel accepted by any one place, culture, nation was always the case wherever I found myself, and so books were always my consolation. And I think that over time, reading and eventually writing led me farther and farther away from the place where that question mattered anymore. And so I feel that I finally, as an adult, as a writer, have arrived at that place where the question of whether I'm this or that or the other thing no longer is relevant to me and no longer feels like a lack. It did feel like a lack when I was growing up, which is why I think I turned to literature to fill that lack or that void that I felt.
Great. I think we've got two people with the microphone, so these will have to be the last two, I think. But I think there's someone over there, isn't there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Question for Ruth Ozeki. Ruth, I guess there's not many books on the Booker shortlist over the years that have drawn on quantum mechanics as part of the plot of the book, with the sort of entangled particles and the many world theory and all this thing that's kind of quite woven into the plot. You talked a lot about the genesis of the book and how you developed it over time. Was that something that you developed very early on, or did it come as you sort of wrote the plot and developed the book?
It came as I wrote the book, but at the same time, I'd always been familiar with with the thought experiment, the Schrödinger's cat thought experiment, and I'd always had a kind of and I think probably most novelists do have a sort of an intuitive sense, even if we can't do the math and perhaps don't understand it on that level, that we have an intuitive sense of what happens when an array of particles collapses into a single point, and because I think that's what we practice every day. I mean, it's a sense that that there are multiple worlds, and certainly the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is I think, once again, something that as novelists, we just kind of intuitively understand that. As it turned out in this book, it was certainly not something I had intended to introduce into the book itself, but much as I think many of us have been talking about here, you take step by step, and step by step, the sort of the array of possibilities kind of narrows, and at a certain point in the book, fairly late on, suddenly I realized that this was, that this actually fitted into the book in a, and enhanced the plot of the book as well. So I was very happy when that happened.
That's great. And then this will be the final question from the audience over there. Thanks.
I just wanted to ask Jhumpa and also Rita what your favourite book is.
I don't know, who's... Ruth.
Sorry,
yeah. Ruth and Jhumpa, yeah, your favourite book.
Well, I wouldn't, once again, to go back to this quantum idea, I wouldn't want to ever choose a favourite.
Jhumpa.
I would more or less agree, but I was asked this question recently, and so I'll give you the same answer. It was Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Thank you. Now, in the past, writers have reacted to winning the Booker Prize in different ways. One gave the prize to the Black Panther movement. Another one built a swimming pool at her French home. Bethan May Bishop on Twitter asks, so this will be the final question, you can be as brief as you want, you may not want to say anything. What would winning the prize mean to you? NoViolet.
A lot.
Eleanor.
I find this question, I've come over all superstitious. I don't really want to answer if it's
That's
okay.
a perfectly fair answer. Jim, who is known, has admitted that he lies all the time, but go on.
Well, I'm going to strike a pious note, but it's also true, I think, to say that once you've made the shortlist, you are winners. This is the point where your sales increase, where you get this sort of attention, where you meet a new audience. And so I don't think anyone is going to go away on Tuesday night feeling anything other than a bit deflated for about half a day. We've all done well to have been on the shortlist. We're very lucky to be on the shortlist. It's been a lot of fun. So it'll just be the icing on the cake to actually get the bigger of the checks.
Jhumpa.
I agree. This is such a beautiful moment. I feel so honored, so fortunate, so privileged to be here with all of you, and I can't really see beyond it, to be honest. I think just enjoying the moment right now feels very good.
Ruth.
Just meeting these authors and reading their work has already been like winning the prize. So.
And Colm.
Readers. Just readers.
A very good note on which to end. Thank you very much to NoViolet Bulawayo, Eleanor Catton, Jim Crace, Jhumpa Lahiri, Ruth Ozeki, and Colm Tóibín, and particularly to all of you. Thank you.